everyone, and welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Phil.
And I'm Pat.
And today we're going to be talking about pieces of airsoft kit that stand out in our memory and history playing airsoft. We're hoping you might learn from our experience here, but mostly there are some pretty good stories around them. We're going to begin by talking about the worst pieces of airsoft kit we've ever bought or owned. Chances are we all have bought something at some point for airsoft that we thought was going to be amazing, and it just didn't live up to our expectation. And there's no shame in that. Once you get over the sting of it, you can actually look back and sometimes have a good laugh about how silly you were, maybe blinded by the coolness of it into ignoring poor reviews or whatever it was. I know that personally, over the course of 14 years of airsoft, I've bought a lot of stuff, both big and small, that didn't really work out for me, but there are a few that really stand out as atrociously bad.
Yeah, I haven't been playing quite as long, but I definitely also have some pieces of kit that were terrible choices. They're really funny in hindsight, but I should not have paid money for them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that you'll find most airsofters who've played for an extended period of time will get to a point where they've realized, you know what, I bought this because it was cool, but it really didn't do for me what I would expect, right? And for me, the one that stands out the most is the L96 sniper rifle that I bought and then we upgraded and built in 2008, 2009, I believe.
That has to be the king of effort on our part, like both of us put together, in terms of man hours for dumb ideas our crew has run.
Yeah, I remember I had watched on Military Channel a bunch of documentaries about sniper school, and I was like, okay, well, cool, I can build a ghillie suit, and I can build a sniper rifle that will go with it, and it'll be great for airsoft. So we got to working. I had an old CatPad BDU. I went out, I bought some netting, we glued the netting onto the BDU, which is kind of the way that they did it at the time in sniper school. You know, they would glue, they would stitch in the netting.
And I think we used glue because our sewing skills at the time were those of like 22-year-olds in university.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can't sew a hole in my socks closed.
Yeah, like Pat was saying, like not really good at sewing, but we did use shoe glue and like all the other kinds of glue, like hot glue and stuff, to put the netting in place. And then we went and bought some like vinyl for the front to reinforce the front, because I would be crawling and I'd be going on my elbows and my knees a lot. And then we went out and we bought burlap, and the burlap was of course just brown colored. That was no good, so it needed to be dyed. So I bought RIT dye and we hand dyed meters upon meters of burlap in a couple of different colors.
And because we're not very bright, we cut it into strips before we hand dyed it, rather than just hand dyeing large sections of it, because that would have been too clever.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it was a learning process, and that's fine.
Absolutely.
Anyways, you know, we got through it. We dyed it over the course of a couple of days. We got everything done, and then it was a matter of tying it on to the BDU, which, again, tedious process. I remember we were in the living room. We put on a bunch of like Rambo DVDs or some Predator or
Generation Kill.
Yeah, just whatever we had at the time that was really trendy and made us feel like this was a really good idea. And over the course of several hours, a couple of days, we tied all the burlap onto the ghillie suit, and you know what? We made a ghillie suit. It certainly was exactly what it was supposed to be.
Did up a big old head cover, took it outside and dragged it through the dirt a couple of times.
Yeah, so we were really excited. You know, I've got this ghillie suit. It's going to be great. I can't wait to wear it. I'm going to be invisible. Like, that's really what's going to happen. And then the second part was we need to build a rifle that will allow me to use the ghillie suit effectively, which is to say I could engage at really long distances. And so I had seen on Airsoft Canada an L96, and it looked really cool. It had a bipod. It had a scope. Like, what more do you want? And I figured out that there were some parts that we could get that would enable us to use 8EG barrel instead of a sniper rifle barrel. So we ended up getting a PDI hop-up chamber to fit in a 6.01 millimeter rifle length 8EG barrel. We got a more powerful spring. We upgraded the piston. We did a whole bunch of stuff. By the end of it, I think we had probably, I don't know how many hours we had sunk into it, but I know I must have spent at least $1,000, maybe $1,500 on all the parts and all the...
Absolutely. I mean, and I'm probably closer to the 1,500 mark, because I remember you bought, the scope you bought was good enough that it's still in circulation somewhere in the local airsoft community. Like, it's been passed around from person to person who wants to try having a really high magnification optic. And it's quite a good scope for an airsoft rifle. It's not real steel, but as airsoft replicas go, it is just fantastic.
Yeah, yeah, and I remember it was like a variable power magnification, all this kind of stuff, and the eye relief was okay. So I had a rifle setup that we thought was pretty good, and we had a ghillie suit that we thought was great. So we went up to Redcliffe and we tried it out, and I played one game with it, and I was like, nope, that's it. I'm not interested.
When we say game, we mean he played one game, not a day. A game. It's like, I hate everything about this.
Yeah. Firstly, wearing the ghillie suit was really hot, and I was definitely not prepared for that. But the reality was that we had spent a lot of money to build a rifle that not only was it extremely unwieldy because it was large and it weighed a lot and it was difficult to reload and all this kind of stuff, but in practicality, it didn't have that much more range than my AEG, maybe 50 feet, which might seem like a fair distance, but realistically, it's an extra 50. It was an extra 50 feet of range. That wasn't a consistent 50 feet, and it was still a bolt action rifle, which meant that if my position was made, I was getting shot at by guys with like high caps and stuff, and they were in a very good position to just run around and get the drop on me, right?
I mean, factually speaking, we didn't have an R-Hop for it. R-Hops weren't a thing when we made that gun.
Yep.
I don't think we really did a whole lot to upgrade like the piston, which certainly the piston, the chamber, or anything like that. So certainly that meant that it wasn't as nice as it could have been. But the spring in it was super heavy, and it was hard to pull back. Like, it was a difficult weapon to operate.
Yeah. It looked great, and at the time, like conceptually, I thought, yeah, I was going to do the sniper thing. I'd be able to crawl along. I'd be able to use the rifle. And the fact is that at the end of the day, it was just not effective. It was a piece of garbage, right? Like, it itself in isolation was not necessarily garbage, but for the field we play on, for the play style that I used, for the type of games that we were playing, it was just not effective. I spent most of one game just in one position waiting for someone to come across my crosshairs, and they didn't see me, and they came across my crosshairs, and I shot at them, and I can't remember if I hit them or not, but then I got shot. That was it. Right? And I thought that was very, very frustrating. Definitely did not live up to my expectations.
It's worth noting, right? The ergonomics of this gun were also not great for Phil, because he's not a tall guy, and it was a big gun.
Yep. And that's the kind of thing that at the end of the day, so I played one game and I was like, nope, this was not fun. I still played the rest of the day and, gave it the old college try, so to speak. But I never used that ghillie suit after. I brought the rifle out to a couple of games and I tried it out, and that was marginally better, but I never used the ghillie suit after. And then in short order, I think within about a month, I had sold the rifle off.
The pre-upgrade version of that rifle is actually the first airsoft gun I ever used at a game. And honestly, I think it worked better as a like medium engagement distance bolt action rifle than it ever really did once we heavily upgraded it, in terms of getting shot volume being more useful than upgrading the spring as much as we did so that it would get better, air quotes, range.
Yeah, if you listen to one of our previous episodes where we talk about like barrel length and stuff like that, there's probably a lot mechanically going on there that we didn't really understand, like over-voluming and all this kind of stuff.
Definitely.
Which we're not going to get into right now. But I think at the end of the day, in my mind, I had this great platform built out and it was going to be great. I was going to be, well, at this point, I guess it would be the pre-Novrich because he wasn't around back then. But like, I was going to be this, sniping sensation, and it's just, that's not at all how it materialized. And it stung for a while because I sold that rifle off and I probably got like $400 for it or something. And given how much money I had put into it, I felt like I really had taken a big loss on it. But it had to happen. Like, it was just sitting on my shelf. I was never really going to use it again, right?
And I mean, you put that money towards upgrading your SCAR, so like that part of it worked out to some extent. I mean, and you ended up running the really long SCAR, but at least it was a really accurate automatic and semi-automatic airsoft rifle. But yeah, I mean, it's one of these things. Like, we're going to talk shortly about my equivalent, and not unlike Phil, my equivalent cost me a lot of money and didn't necessarily get me anything.
As we talk about these, I think the point we're trying to make is at some point we had to have this honest conversation with ourselves to say, like, you know what, although it stings, this is a piece of garbage and you need to offload it, or at least turn it into a wall hanger and not try and force the issue, right? That's definitely what happened with the L96. I know for you, yours is, like you said earlier, I mean, it's a similar situation, right?
So yeah, definitely. A little later than the L96, I bought a M203 to mount on my then M16, And I actually had the M16 set up into a pretty good long-range rifle that I really liked a whole lot. And I spent $400 on parts to switch it over to an M4 carbine length and put a 203 on it. And then $600 on CO2 capable grenades and a CO2 charger and just tons and tons of stuff for that M203, pouches to carry the M203 grenades. And it's super fun. I at least can say, relative to the LNA6, I did have a lot of fun with my M203. I ran it for a couple of years, and watching the people scatter when you pull that trigger and hear that loud pop is definitely fun. But I have to talk about effectiveness, right? Like we've said before, we try to play with an eye towards, winning our games.
Yeah.
And that pile of kit weighed a ton. It took up a huge amount of space, and mostly it caused me to have a shorter barrel than I wanted to have for sort of the marksman role that I tend to play on our team, the sort of second line fire support / Overwatch that I do. And M203s are heavy. Like, sure, the airsoft ones aren't made of steel, but it still weighs 5 pounds on the front of your gun that you're trying to keep up so that you can shoot. So I spent $1,200 on running this M203. I ran it for 2 years. Running the grenades for it on CO2 increases the wear and tear on them, so that was expensive in terms of upkeep. And I think net, I may have gotten 6 kills over 2 years that were made possible by the M203.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you shot more people who were like, oh man, can you shoot me with the 203? I want to see what it feels like, than you did actually shooting people during a game.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, it was loads of fun as a cool toy that for show and tell.
And a deterrent in some cases.
And definitely new players who had never encountered the 203 before were like, oh god, I'm not going anywhere near that guy. But that wears off really quickly. And, if you're playing in a community where you have a ton of new players and they don't come back, you should rethink things, really. That's not what you want. Mm-hmm. So here I was carrying around this gigantic thing. And for Fashion Soft, it was fantastic. It looks super cool in photos, right? But eventually, I was all right, I hit a point where I was doing another evaluation of my kit to see what worked and what didn't and thinking about it. And I went, okay, this does nothing and complicates my life. And so I went and bought the parts for the gun that I'm currently using, which I paid for by selling the gun the 203 was mounted on at a reasonable price. But I think I got $200 back for the 203, including all of the stuff for it, right? So I ate about $800 on playing with that grenade launcher for 2 years for a whole lot of laughs, definitely, but absolutely zero positive effect in any game.
I don't think there's any situation where we were playing Airsoft together where I ever thought, you know what, our situation could be greatly improved by a judicial application of a 203 right now. Not an Airsoft 203, because an Airsoft 203 is a shotgun, more or less, right? They call it a noob tube. I mean, all it is really just a shower of BBs. If it was throwing a grenade, that would be one thing, but Airsoft 203s don't do that, and I never had that experience, right?
Worse than it being a shotgun, it's a 40mm underbarrel loading single shot shotgun that costs you a ton of money to put on your gun and weighs in it a huge amount for negligible effect. I've been using my current rifle for 3 years, so I've only been out of the 203 market for 3 years, and I've had absolutely zero situations where I missed the 203. Whereas when I was using the 203, I definitely had situations where I chose to fire the 203 for the fun of it, rather than engaging the target correctly with my rifle in semi and killing them.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious, but that wasn't a good choice. That didn't work well for me. Some of you guys, when you were listening to what Phil was saying, were like, well, what about the tag-in launchable, goes 150 feet rounds? So firstly, in Canada, the 2 pyro ones that actually fling BBs are illegal. You just can't own them, so they're no good there. And honestly, I have considerable issue with the idea of firing a heavy projectile or relatively heavy projectile that can fly 150 feet at someone I'm playing Airsoft with. I don't really want to hit people with one of those. I feel like it would probably not be super great. I don't think it's going to injure them as such, but I feel like if someone, shot me with one of those, I'd be pretty annoyed. I'd be mad about it, especially, as the huge bruise that it left formed. And I don't want to be doing that to people. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's less about what the grenades that you have for Airsoft can be applied for, because there are a few things that you can make sort of use of them for. I know, some bigger milsim events use them to shoot, a foam ball that can be counted as a destroyer, as a thing that will destroy targets and, maybe take out vehicles and stuff. But we don't play in those games, and at the end of the day, the ability to pull the trigger and take a player out of the game in one or two trigger pulls is vastly superior to the ability to pull the trigger on my M203 and take the same player out by flacking them with just a pile of BBs.
Yeah, that's right. Because you're shooting like 140 rounds or something, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right? You know, like 180 rounds, 140 rounds for no effect that I couldn't have accomplished by pulling the trigger correctly. And I've moved my hand off the trigger from my rifle, so I then have an empty 203 launcher and a hand that is not capable of pulling the trigger that I need to be pulling if there's another guy.
Another example for me of a piece of kit that really did not work out the way that I intended to was probably four or so years ago. I'd been playing a lot of Arma with like Mark and the guys, and in Arma, one thing that you can do is have a UAV controller, like a drone controller. And I was like, man, there's this drone on the market called a Parrot drone, and it's supposed to be pretty easy to fly. You can fly it with your cell phone. It has a camera. That would be great for us for an airsoft game. So I went out, I found one that was being sold sort of secondhand on Kijiji or something like that. And I bought it. And I was like...
And I gotta say, I was on board with this idea. Like, yeah, we'll have a flying thing with a camera that we can look at and go, oh, they're over there? Great. That's super useful.
So it's worth noting that I know nothing about remote-controlled devices, right? Like, I've never owned an RC plane. I've never owned an RC car. Nothing like that. So I was going into this market basically sort of blind. But, hey, it's got an app on your phone. How hard can it really be? And to be fair, in my understanding of drones, is that it's quadcopter drones are relatively easy to fly. So I figured, hey, I'm not a complete soup sandwich. I can probably figure this out. So I bought the drone. I was really excited about it. And the reality of drone technology at the time, and it has evolved a lot since then. There's a drone right now. It's called a Magic drone. I think it's got like 249 grams. It weighs nothing. It's super easy to control. It does great video, like all this kind of stuff, right? That technology now is much better than it was back then. The Parrot drone, the battery life sucked. It was definitely difficult to control. The app never really worked on the phone very well. I couldn't fly the thing. It wasn't super stable, and it was loud. It was very, very loud. It was also quite large. And so it never actually did go to an airsoft game with me.
One of the things that we only thought of after Phil had bought the drone is also that, like, there's nothing really to prevent someone at an airsoft game from shooting your drone if it's being used as a tool in play, right? If someone's taking video with it, yeah, no one's going to shoot at the guy going, yeah, I'm taking video with my expensive toy because I'm going to post it on YouTube later and it'll be really cool. But if you're using it to scout and someone on the enemy team is willing to piss you off by shooting it, and that can definitely happen, an airsoft gun will absolutely destroy a drone.
Yeah, especially like a plastic drone, plastic rotors and stuff. Like it's quite possible. So at the end of the day, I had this several $100 toy in my house that never actually did the thing that it was supposed to do. Overall, I was extremely disappointed. I mean, it still lives in my basement. I don't want to sell it off because the thing doesn't really work the way that it should. And even if it had, though, what it would have delivered for me on the field is nowhere near what I expected it to be, right, at the end of the day.
And, I mean, another thing that's sort of rough about the drone is that it was obsolete almost before you bought it, in terms of people who are interested in drones.
Yeah, that's right.
Another example from my own purchases, and it's seeming to me as I talk about this that most of my bad choices have been gun-related. At one point, I bought an A&K Mark 46 Para, which is a light machine gun.
Kind of like a saw, right?
Yeah, it's essentially a slightly modernized saw with lots of rail real estate. And I was like, oh man, I can put all sorts of cool stuff on my saw. So, firstly, I don't run very much on my rifle. I run an optic. That's it. In its previous incarnation, when I had a 203 on it, I ran a 203 and an optic, and that was it. So the real estate wasn't really terribly useful on this thing, but I was like, oh, it's really cool. It has a bipod, and I'll like be able to set up and shoot lots of BBs at people, and I'll be Rambo-y. It'll be great. Lots and lots of DECA. But as it turned out, there was basically nothing I liked about either the playstyle or the airsoft rifle. It was really, really heavy and unwieldy. The rails and bipod on the front meant it was super front heavy, so it was hard to keep up at a ready position without hitting the ground and kipping out the bipod. You don't always want to be on the ground with a bipod out. Airsoft LMGs don't have the range their real-world counterparts do, which means that their fields of fire end up being functionally vastly more limited. It did, interestingly, make me a huge BB magnet. So I ended up sort of tanking for the team because as soon as people saw me with, they're like, oh god, I don't want to get shot at by that LMG. We're just going to pour fire on Pat. And funnily, that still happens at games to people running LMGs, and it still happens to me. We mentioned a while ago, like there's a player in the local field who runs an RPK, and I know that I don't need to be more afraid of that RPK than I do of the guy with an AK standing next to him, but I still go, oh god, RPK. But it weighed a ton. The box mag it came with was garbage. It didn't feed well. It was supposed to be sound operated. That didn't work super well. So I had to hit a button to wind the ammo for it, and I had to do it all the time, and it didn't work very well even when it was doing that. I couldn't move as effectively carrying it. It didn't have any range. It had this great feature where it's like it mimics the real one, has a swappable barrel, so that if your barrel gets too hot, you can change it out real quick. Or so you can change barrel lengths. On an airsoft gun, obviously, that doesn't provide you with benefits, but that switch is super easy to hit on the A&K version, and so sometimes you're playing and you bump it off of a tree and your barrel falls out, and your inner barrel is inside of your real barrel, so it comes out too, and you're like, well, I guess I have to put my gun back together in the middle of this game real quick, excuse me. Mm-hmm. So it was just ineffective and big and heavy, and it cost me $600. And I did sell it. I didn't sell it for what I paid for it, because that's just not how airsoft works. I'm pretty sure actually I used the money to pay for the chest rig that I'm using right now, which is in every way a better purchase, right? And I can't even really say I had a lot of fun with the A&K because I couldn't play effectively with it in any fashion. It didn't have the reach I wanted. If I was close enough to people to use it effectively, I was just hosing them with BBs, which I don't like as an element of play. The box mag was actually less effective than just running a high cap in my gun. Not that I do that with my M4, but it would have been better. And it just got me nothing other than, I guess it gets me a funny story and some slight embarrassment now. And I think most of my teammates probably tried it for a game.
I played some games with Mark 46 as well, and there is a bit of a catharsis that comes with like having that machine gun and shooting it from the hip, and that's a lot of fun, but the fun sort of wears out pretty quickly once you start getting lit up by like 50 different players, and 2, once you realize that actually I could have been just as effective, if not more effective, using my regular primary weapon system, right?
And I mean, it's worth noting, one of our teammates does own a CA249, and it's significantly lighter because it's got less metal all over it, and it is a little bit more accurate. I think it's a better built gun in terms of its internal components and its internal functionality, and it's probably more upgradable than the A&K was. But he essentially only brings that to games for the fun of having a big box mag now and then, and for photo ops. We've used it for cool stuff a lot more than we've used for good, effective gameplay.
That's a pretty neat segue in sort of the next part of Standout Kit that I wanted to talk about, which is Cool Kit. So on the one hand, we have these pieces of kit that are just garbage and they didn't live up to our expectations. But then on the other hand, we have pieces of kit that stand out because they're maybe not the best, but they are super cool. Like, we can't wait to show them off. Or, they really... they complete a look for you, or there's something that they're sort of the apple of your eye, right? They're like the pride of your collection.
And yeah, like there's that aspect of this, lots and lots of people who play Airsoft do engage in and enjoy fashion soft. And Phil and I are absolutely amongst them. Phil's a big camo nut, as he's talked about previously. When I started playing Airsoft, we bought new camo, matching camo, and we bought multicam because it was the new, fabulous, hot thing, and we wanted to be fashionable. So yeah, like we have some kit that we love because it works really, really well, right? I love my rifle. It does everything I want it to. It's fantastic. But it's essentially just an M4 from a visual point of view, so, it's not fancy, as it were.
Mm-hmm. I know for me, when I think about like standout pieces of kit that are just super cool, I think to that law, right? The M72 law that I have on my wall. It doesn't really come out to very many games, but I love showing it off to people. I mean, it was a gift from you guys, number one. Like, the whole team threw in and got me a law because they knew that I just love it visually. It's got all the right markings. It's a deep fire law, so it's meant to fire those 2 or 3 grenade shells, of which, Pat used to have and supply at the time. It wasn't super effective in terms of what you did on the field. I wouldn't definitely not call it garbage, but in terms of just being cool, it operates very similar. You expand the tube. It looks awesome. And I think there's a difference between picking up a piece of kit that you think is really cool and also doesn't really do a whole lot, and a piece of kit that you expect to be able to do a lot with and actually doesn't deliver on that, right?
So the law, if it comes down to it, you can put a 203 round into it, you can put an Nerf football in it, and you can fire it at, the technical we built out of a truck that we paid nothing for, right? Like, that's viable. It'll do that. It'll probably even hit the truck if you're close enough. But, you're not using it as your primary or secondary or even tertiary weapon system in an airsoft game. So your expectations are, I want it to make a bang and shoot a football that away.
Yeah.
Whereas with, the Mark 46, I was like, man, this is going to be awesome. I'm going to have a new style of play. It's going to be different than just, running a rifle. It's going to be cool. It's going to be badass. And I'm going to be effective. And the thing that it really fell down on for me was just being completely not useful and honestly not a play style I enjoyed, right? You can definitely build a squad support weapon for airsoft that will work well and do a lot of the things you'd want it to do and that you're thinking about it doing. So the Mark 46 for me was an issue in that it specifically wasn't, as it turned out, a very good airsoft light machine gun, but it also wasn't a playstyle I enjoyed, so it was just a waste of my time and money.
And it's different if you're playing a milsim game or something where you got like ammo caps and all this kind of stuff, and you're trying to replicate like a real military fire team or squad or what have you, and you have to say, okay, well, it's a squad, so we need a light machine gunner or whatever. So that's one sort of specific use case, but we're talking sort of in general and in our experience where we haven't played milsims where we have to replicate a squad, right? Where we've had to have, no, at least one guy has to have a light machine gun and we need a grenadier and stuff. Like we've never really done that.
And the reality is that if we were to do that, we would probably do it using some of the stuff that our players do have without focusing on some of the things that we were just talking about, right? If you're going to go to a milsim game where they want you to use like, real cap mags or 60 round mags, and everyone has a specific ammo limit that they're allowed, except for light machine gun guys who are allowed to have more ammo, the LMG really does shine there. It becomes a lot more useful because it becomes a lot more akin to its real world counterparts. But as we've talked about before, we exist in sort of the happy or unhappy medium between players who like milsim and play some and organize some, but don't commit themselves fully to milsim because it's not super viable for our play environment, and the player who just wants to go have some games at his local field. And the benefit to those weapons really shines in really strict milsim stuff, in my opinion. One of the things that's worth noting there is when we run milsim events here, we don't usually tell people they have to have an ammo capacity or a max amount in a mag or anything, because we don't want to exclude new players or players who don't have as much money from coming to our milsim games and enjoying the experience, which means that we can't do the things that would make the LMG sort of arguably better in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So sort of continuing on that note of like gear that you really like to show off, I like unique guns. I like having guns that are sort of the odd man out, if you will. Probably my favorite airsoft gun I currently own, certainly the one I show to players when I bring it to games the most, is I have an M1 Garand that I bought relatively recently because one of our teammates has convinced me to do a historical World War II kit. And I chose to do a US GI kit rather than a paratrooper kit because there are less of them and I find that appealing. I guess I'm sort of an airsoft hipster in that way. Dressing in old clothes, using an old gun, definitely checks out. So it's a really nice gun. It's essentially internally an M14, different mags, but it's really pretty. It's full wood and metal. It's got a historically accurate sling, and it's super fun to shoot. And it's just cool. And I bring it to games and people are like, that's really different. Like, I haven't seen one of those before. Can I shoot it? Can I play with it? Can I see what it looks like? And it makes for cool photos. It's just a really fun piece of kit. I've also got a Thompson for my World War II kit. And the Thompson is very effective. It's basically a little M4 in terms of how it functions mechanically for me on the field. So it's a great carbine. It can shoot auto. It has a good quick semi-auto with a nice trigger response. But it's not as much fun as the Garand, and it's just not as cool.
I think the Garand is a good example of kind of the opposite of what we were talking about at the start, of a cool piece of kit that doesn't live up to your expectations. I think when we were talking about this, when we were writing our talking points for this episode, one thing that we had said was that our expectations for the Garand were quite low. It's like, it's going to look good, but its function, it's kind of like, well, that's not really the point.
Absolutely, and I was staggered. It for a stock gun, it shoots as well as any stock gun I've ever owned, better than most of them. It's pretty accurate. It's got good reach. It's very fun to shoot. It's very it's not pointable at all. It's a big, heavy gun, but hey, I'm a big guy. I've got long arms. It's fine. But it puts rounds where I want them to go. The rate of fire is great. You know, the trigger pulls a little heavy, but it doesn't have any trouble cycling on semi. I think after gaming it, I kind of do want to take it apart and upgrade it at some point because I want to see what I can do with it. But that's sort of the gun tech in me giggling and going, man, I bet I can make this ridiculous where it's already pretty good. And yeah, I was expecting it to just be a cool looking gun that I would use some of the time. And as it turns out, it's a really excellent rifle that kind of lives up to the heritage of the M1 Garand. It is an excellent rifle and really, really fun to shoot and pretty accurate. You know, I kind of, like I said, I kind of want to go put an R-Hop in it just to see what'll happen. And because, admittedly, the idea of putting an R-Hop in a Garand and firing at people from 150 feet away and hitting them and having them go, ugh, is extremely appealing.
So we hope you found the stories of some of our poor airsoft decisions as well as our coolest pieces of kit entertaining. And I know many of us will have experienced similar things throughout our time playing airsoft.
So please reach out to us. Let us know that we're not alone in making sort of questionable airsoft life choices on the grounds that something looks cool or makes loud noises and that seems appealing. We're always happy to hear from you guys. Maybe in the future we could do an episode where we talk about some stories you guys have told us, hopefully.
So thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you had a great time, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers, everybody.